In the dim light of a March morning in 1945, the frozen woods outside Paderborn, Germany, suddenly shook with the roar of tank treads and thunderous explosions. Along a winding forest trail, a column of American military vehicles had just driven into an ambush. Machine gun fire hissed overhead, and anti-tank shells tore into the earth. Amid the thick haze of gun smoke, a two-star American general was not hidden away in a safe rear command post. He was right there, at the very front, riding in the lead jeep. That man was Major General Maurice Rose, the famed commander of the 3rd Armored Division, and it was in this most perilous of places that he was about to meet the tragic fate that would define his legacy. Maurice Rose was born in 1899 inches, Connecticut, and grew up in Denver, in an immigrant Jewish family, with no military tradition. At just 15, he lied about his age to enlist, determined to pursue a military career. When the United States entered World War I, Rose became a young officer and quickly proved his toughness on the battlefields of France. Severely wounded during the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in 1918, he escaped from the hospital to rejoin his unit, an act so daring that medics mistakenly reported him as killed in action. In the years that followed, Rose remained in the army, specializing in armored warfare. He was known as a disciplined, highly capable officer who always chose the hardest path to reach victory. The outbreak of World War II in 1941 gave Maurice Rose the opportunity to demonstrate the command talent he had been honing for years. He had no flair for theatrics or memorable soundbites to carve out a place in history. But one thing stood out unmistakably. On every battlefield he crossed from North Africa to Germany, he always positioned himself where others would hesitate to go. In March 1943, the Tunisia campaign neared its conclusion. The last German units were retreating in chaos through the sun-scorched eastern hills, leaving behind ruined towns and trails of blood in the sand. Maurice Rose's unit received orders to intercept one of the withdrawing German divisions. They moved into position, ready to open fire. Then came unexpected news. The enemy was signaling a desire to surrender. Not just a handful of scattered soldiers, but an entire group, around 6,000 men. A heavy silence fell over the command post, a situation no training manual had ever prepared for. No one could be sure whether the Germans were telling the truth or setting a trap. Several officers proposed sending a reconnaissance team. A few others suggested firing warning shells to force the enemy out of their trenches. All ideas made sense. They were safe, careful, calculated, but Rose said nothing. He simply stood up and walked toward his jeep. No white flag, no escort, no preliminary negotiation. He simply got in the vehicle, taking only a driver and a sidearm at his waist, and drove straight into an uncontrolled zone just hours earlier. It had been the eye of a storm of gunfire. No one understood what he was thinking, and no one dared stop him. As his jeep rolled across the dead zone, land held by neither side, tense eyes followed every turn of the wheels across the sand. There was no security detail, no radio communication, only a trust in instinct. And in what he believed was right, that sometimes the presence of a commander could change the outcome of a battle without a single drop of blood spilled. The jeep kept moving until it stopped at the edge of the enemy's line. Then something extraordinary happened. Groups of German soldiers, hands raised high, began stepping out of their trenches. Not a single shot fired. No shouted commands. Only white shirts hastily tied to rifles, and the exhausted faces of men who had lost both their ideals and their strength. Rose stood there, alone, watching as 6,000 German troops laid down their weapons. Not another bullet was fired. Later, when someone asked why he risked himself like that, he answered simply, "I didn't go there to be brave. I went so my men wouldn't have to die over a misunderstanding." And that wasn't a quote for the history books. It was simply how he lived throughout the war. In Rose's view, if someone had to step into a place where survival wasn't guaranteed, that person should be the commander. The one who gave the order had to understand its cost, not from reports, but from the feel of the ground beneath their boots and the heat of bullets grazing past. 6,000 men surrendering didn't put Rose's name in the newspapers. But among the ranks he later led from Carentan to Aachen, from Cologne to Paderborn, the name Maurice Rose became synonymous with one thing. He was the first to reach the battlefield, and often the last to leave. Not because he sought glory, but because he couldn't do otherwise. When he saw his men facing enemy fire, he never believed he had the right to stand somewhere safer than they did. And that, above all, is why he was known as the general who always stood where bullets flew the lowest. In July 1944, the battlefront in Normandy began to shift. After weeks of brutal fighting through a maze of hedgerows and bombed-out villages, American forces finally broke open a narrow corridor to the south. But that path remained fragile, and Carentan, a small town at a strategic junction, was becoming the most vulnerable link. A sudden German counterattack had tightly encircled the 101st Airborne paratroopers inside the town. They were trapped among ruined buildings, their ammunition running out, reinforcements not yet arrived. At the command level, the situation remained unclear. Reports were incomplete, maps were outdated, and counterattack orders were still sitting, with staff officers stationed dozens of kilometers from the front. At that moment, Maurice Rose was commanding Combat Command A, positioned nearby. Upon hearing that Carentan was about to fall, he didn't wait for permission, nor did he wait for any formal assignment. He simply stepped outside, climbed into his jeep, and drove toward the sound of artillery that was drawing nearer by the minute. The road into Carentan was choked with dust and smoke. Rose drove through layer after layer of checkpoints, past units hunkered down defending intersections, never stopping to ask for updates. He didn't need more reports, he wanted to see with his own eyes. Ahead, Carentan was still burning. Gunfire echoed through the streets. Rooftops were collapsing in pieces. Shells skimmed over the hood of his vehicle. Part of the town had already been lost. But near a narrow corner against a brick wall, he spotted a platoon from the 101st trying to hold on to the last bit of ground. They had fought for hours, their weapons overheated, their bodies exhausted. A young officer, having just reloaded a fresh magazine, slumped back against the wall, no one left to give orders. They hadn't retreated, but they no longer had the strength to push forward. Rose stepped forward, his eyes scanning the formation. No words of encouragement, no stirring speech. He looked straight at the officer and said, "Get your men out of the hole. We're going to fight back, right now." That line would later be passed down in the unit like a call to arms. No high-level orders, no reinforcements. That platoon stood up, regrouped, and counterattacked. The move was so unexpected that the Germans hesitated. And in that brief pause, a flanking reinforcement unit arrived in time to seal the front. By the end of the day, Carentan remained in American hands. After the battle, there was no formal commendation for Rose, but the soldiers who fought that day remembered the look in his eyes as he appeared amid the rubble, as if he hadn't come to issue commands, but to share in life and death alongside them. To them, that presence carried more weight than any slogan, because he was the one who chose to be where bullets flew the lowest, when no one had ordered him to be there. By the fall of 1944, as the leaves began to fall in the forests near the German border, the Allies stood for the first time before the gateway to the heart of Germany. But to cross it, they had to overcome what seemed like an impenetrable obstacle. The Siegfried Line, a vast system of bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and dense dragon's teeth, defenses stretching for hundreds of kilometers. It was more than a defensive barrier. It was the final symbol of Nazi Germany's desperate resistance. While infantry units were still setting up artillery and clearing paths for an assault expected to take several days, Maurice Rose chose a different approach. He climbed into his familiar jeep, drove himself past barbed wire and uncleared minefields, and reached the forward assault positions of the 3rd Armored Division, his own command. Amid scattered artillery fire and a valley still shrouded in smoke, he gave orders for every tank crew to advance without waiting for supporting fire. His words that day were clearly recorded in the campaign journal. "Don't wait for support. Drive straight into the fire." A cold, blunt order, but behind it lay the judgment of a commander who had survived war with sharp intuition and a heart that refused to trade the lives of his men for bureaucratic caution. That decision paved the way for the 3rd Armored Division to become the first American armored unit to break through the Siegfried Line and capture Stolberg, the first town seized on German soil, faster than anyone at high command had predicted. But not every turning point comes in autumn sunlight. Winter arrived, colder and more brutal than any battlefield before it. At the end of 1944, just as the front seemed to stabilize, the Germans launched their final counteroffensive, the Battle of the Ardennes, also known as the Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell so thick that artillery had to cease fire, supply lines were severed, and most American generals, following advisors' recommendations, withdrew to command from a distance, relying on radio reports instead of direct observation. But Rose didn't pull back. He kept his headquarters only a few kilometers from the front, close enough to hear the rumble of tank engines and sometimes the frantic calls over the radio from a disoriented company. When German tanks from the 2nd Panzer Division suddenly broke through a defensive sector, Rose didn't call a meeting. Instead, he climbed into an armored vehicle, drove through pitch-dark forests, reached the breach point, scouted the terrain with his own eyes, marked key elevations, and identified the counterattack routes in the middle of the heaviest snowstorm of the campaign. A few hours later, under his direct command, American tanks launched a simultaneous counterattack. In less than 48 hours, German forces were pushed back. More than 90 Panzer tanks were destroyed, and American casualties were surprisingly low. A victory earned not just by firepower, but by a commander who chose to face the enemy head-on, rather than wait for a map to tell him what was happening. In the coldest depths of the European winter, Maurice Rose once again chose to face danger first, so the rest of his unit could fight behind him, not in the absence of him. But by the 30th of March 1945, the Western Front in Germany was nearing its end. German forces were retreating in fragmented groups, while American troops advanced toward Paderborn, a strategic crossroads guarding the routes deep into the Nazi heartland. Amid a tide of victories, many units had begun to think about home. But where the front line still existed, Maurice Rose remained unchanged from the day he first set foot in Europe, moving forward, staying close to the spearhead, walking beside his men through every stretch of road reeking of gunpowder. That morning, Rose led his command convoy toward the outskirts of Paderborn. He rode in his familiar jeep at the very front, without thick steel armor to shield him, without distance between himself and the frontline troops. The convoy followed narrow forest roads where scattered skirmishes still echoed. The surroundings were eerily quiet, and it was this silence that hid disaster. Suddenly, from the tree line, a German Tiger tank burst out, roaring like a beast cornered to its last breath. The lead vehicle was obliterated in seconds. Rose's jeep, second in line, slid slightly off the path, trapped between two roadside banks with no way out. In that moment, Rose stepped down from the vehicle. Standing tall, arm raised, he acted as a man who knew the rules of war and the weight of his presence in that precise moment. No shouting, no threatening moves. But from the Tiger's turret, a burst of gunfire ripped through the short distance. He collapsed on the damp roadside grass, in front of his driver, under the stunned gaze of the soldiers behind who had not yet realized what had happened. His death came as swiftly as a breath. But behind that single moment lay an entire life lived by a clear principle. A commander must be present at the point of greatest pressure, on the line between victory and collapse. Throughout campaigns from North Africa to Cologne, Maurice Rose kept himself close enough to hear the crack of every rifle, to look into the weary eyes of his soldiers before they charged, and to feel the exact moment a life-or-death decision had to be made. No one ordered him to stand there. He walked to that place by his own will from the age of 18, on the battlefields of France, to that final morning, in Paderborn. At the place where he fell, there were no barricades, no tanks in escort. Only a folded tactical map, a pencil, a pistol on his belt, and the final resolve of a soldier who had lived every day by one belief, that the value of a command lies in whether the one who gives it is willing to bear the danger and consequences it carries. Throughout World War II, while other generals commanded from a distance, Maurice Rose drove his jeep straight to the front lines. While many waited for maps and reports before making decisions, he chose to see with his own eyes, to listen with his own ears, and to act amidst the smoke of battle. It wasn't recklessness, it was his conviction that no order could be truly right without sharing the same danger as the soldiers on the front. To Rose, war was not a strategic game played on a chessboard. It was a place where every decision, advance or hold, flank or charge, was paid for with real blood, from real men. He understood that an order sent from the rear, even if correct, might come too late. But at the front, even an imperfect call made in time could save an entire company. That philosophy wasn't taught in any military manual. It was forged when he escaped a hospital during World War I to return to his unit. It was shaped during sleepless nights, maneuvering tanks through the Tunisian fog. And it was defined in moments when he personally accepted German surrenders just to spare his men from an unnecessary battle. Rose once said he couldn't ask his men to rise from their foxholes unless he himself was willing to lift his own head above them. He believed the presence of a commander in the most dangerous place sent a message louder than any motto or directive. To him, rank wasn't a shield to survive longer than his subordinates. It was the burden of standing closer to death than they did, if that's what the moment demanded. Maurice Rose fell at the age of 45, right beside the front lines, just as Germany was nearing total collapse. He died without witnessing peace and without ever telling his own story. But to those who fought beside him, Rose's legacy needed no book. He lived on in the stories passed between veterans, in the battles where his presence turned the tide, and in the eyes of the soldiers he once led through the fire. Though not a familiar face on wartime headlines, Maurice Rose embodied the ideal every soldier dreamed of serving under a commander who never retreated, never issued orders from afar, never used his rank as a shield against danger. General J. Lawton Collins once called Rose one of the finest division commanders in the U.S. Army. Veteran war correspondent Andy Rooney described him as perhaps the greatest tank general of the war, a man who was always present at the fiercest point of fighting. As the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the U.S. Army during World War II, Rose understood the personal weight of that conflict. He didn't just defeat fascism on the battlefield, he helped liberate his own people from the concentration camps. That legacy, both in combat and in character, earned him a title filled with meaning, the Immaculate Nazi Slayer. Today, the name Maurice Rose is honored in hospitals, monuments, and even on the hull of a U.S. military transport ship. But the greatest legacy he left behind isn't found in memorials. It lives on in a philosophy that the finest generals aren't those in the safest positions, but those who dare to step into the most dangerous places, first and last. For American soldiers of the Second World War, that is why Maurice Rose will forever be remembered as the general who always stood where the bullets flew lowest.